Hello, it's nice to see some faces that I recognize. I'm Marta Kratkovska. I'm a professorial fellow at Trinity and the statutory chair in the Department of Computer Science. I do research in computer science and artificial intelligence, and then I was just explaining my focus is on safety and trust for AI, but I really focus on developing techniques to actually to check and ensure the robustness of these models. I'm the chair of the session today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the various perspectives on defining success in the virtual world. I should probably say defining or redefining. I think COVID has really turned the world upside down for all of us, but this session is trying to look for some positives and opportunities in all our experiences, and whether we can turn things around in our work life to perform even better in front of Zoom or Teams. So thanks for coming, and to Sarah and Sue for organizing it, and especially the speakers for coming along to give us their perspectives. I think first of all, I should say just a few housekeeping things. So please stay muted. There will be an opportunity also for the audience to ask questions. You can use the chat if you want to speak. We will be monitoring this. Now, what we would like to do is we would like to record this session, but only the speakers will be visible, and perhaps only some other people whose cameras are turned on. There will be no names displayed on the recording. So I assume that you are all happy about this. Okay, yeah, great, excellent, excellent. Okay, so what we will do is we'll now ask the speakers to give their perspectives. There will be questions after each talk, and then there will also be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So without further ado, we are going to start with Victoria Baines, who's made an amazing transition from classics to a cybersecurity expert. She is a cybersecurity researcher who's focused on security rhetoric, and she actually has a book which is going to be published later this year. And she's going to tell us now what she sees in in success in the virtual world. So Victoria, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you so much, Marta. And we were just talking before the call started about the fact that Matt and I are former flatmates from Staverton Road. Actually, it's really nice to see others of my flatmates on the call in the audience. So I won't call them out by name, but it's very, very nice to see you. Long time no see. It's great to have these opportunities to remind ourselves that we have to catch up and not just at births, marriages and deaths. So I've spent most of my career analysing the misuse of technology. So apologies in advance for being the downer on the panel. My ideal state would be one in which technology is safe and secure for all the time. And what I'm going to say is inevitably about what happens when things go wrong. But that doesn't mean that I think tech itself is the problem, rather that, as with any other aspect of society, we need to be transparent with the public about the benefits, but also about the risks and how to mitigate them. Now, anticipating future threats is something that policymakers and cybersecurity practitioners are very keen to do for obvious reasons. And in the Cybercrime Futures projects that my team has conducted, we've found that there are certain constants. One of them is that some people will have the urge to do bad things to other people. And the other is that there is a continuous evolution of technology. And those are actually fairly reliable bases on which to anticipate future developments in cybercrime, even 8 to 10 years ahead. But in policymaking and in society in general, what predominates is the notion that prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And depending on whether you're a scientist or a humanities student, that quote to Niels Bohr or to Mark Twain. Now, that sense of powerlessness in the face of uncertainty leads to an almost systemic lack of preparedness, but also to a general feeling of panic about technology being unsafe. And a number of phenomena speak to this, one of which is Zoom bombing, when uninvited guests intrude on video calls like this, and in some cases may display illegal material. Now, after initial panic over the safety of the platform itself, that was found to be due not to a bug in the technology, but to people not protecting their calls with. It came down in the end to a human process vulnerability. Now, technology has proved itself, of course, to be hugely enabling during the pandemic, but that problematic technophobia persists and in some cases is ripe for exploitation. If we think back to the exam results debacle last summer, the initial recourse was to blame the technology, to blame the algorithm used to calculate the grades. But of course, that wasn't the whole story. And the human vulnerabilities are something that we mustn't overlook, particularly as, speaking to your area of specialism, Marta, as AI adoption and automation increase. You know, algorithms are not yet, at least, independent entities with their own agency. They depend on what we feed them, and their impact springs from how we apply them. There's increasing focus on explainable artificial intelligence, and that's absolutely right and proper in light of that increasing adoption of automation and machine learning. But right now, the general population is caught between two extremes: the promise that AI and technology will solve all of our problems, and the belief that in fact the technology is the cause of them. And we already have too many demonstrations that collectively we've not done a particularly good job of explaining how existing technology works. Now, as some of you will know, I've worked for law enforcement and I've worked for big tech, different perspectives on that particular issue. I've also seen unintended consequences and, dare I say, ill-conceived applications of technology in both of those environments. And we could think perhaps of the use of large-scale facial recognition without the public's consent, or algorithms that suggest similar content to that we've already viewed, unwittingly facilitating radicalization of extremists via social media. And perceptions of technology have also been shaped, I think we have to admit, by popular science fiction. And this diet has prompted some tech entrepreneurs to pitch to Star Wars, Blade Runner, Terminator, The Matrix when designing or naming their products. It's also a rich source of iconography for the cybersecurity industry, with its penchant for blue light, moody, hooded figures and apocalyptic cyber doom scenarios. And it can create an impression for the ordinary citizen that digital technology is something remote from reality, something beyond their grasp. So that knowledge gap and those fantastic associations, they can combine to create a space, as I think they have done, in which COVID-19, for example, can be blamed on 5G communications technology, and Bill Gates can be depicted as a Bond villain bent on microchipping us all. But these fear-based theories also align with more legitimate concerns about privacy and surveillance. Now, I'm going to hazard that in the years to come, we'll see smart home, smart work, and outside spaces enabled by the proliferation of 5G, the Internet of Things, superior processing power, massive automation, immersive technologies such as augmented and virtual reality, among others. New threats will arise precisely from the convergence of those technologies. And I, for one, would love to see citizens properly informed about them and empowered to protect against those threats. Those working in cybersecurity, they have the promise of automated response to cyber attacks. Criminals, nation states will be a matter of milliseconds rather than minutes, potentially with no human involvement whatsoever. And those charged with protecting people online will have the opportunity to profile, for example, adults who may pose a threat to children with greater precision and predictive accuracy than ever before. They may be able to identify which young people are about to engage in risky behavior and prevent them from doing so. And those responses are very well-meaning, but they are intrusive. And as we have seen in the very public debates on end-to-end encryption, securing one societal come at the expense of another's safety or privacy. So to sum up, a measure of success for me will be not securing technology from any kind of misuse. I think that's an unrealistic goal, rather striking a balance between security and privacy that is acceptable to the majority of people. And we can't do that unless we explain in plain language what technology routinely does, what it's capable of doing, and what it can't do yet. That's one of the contentions of my research, that demystifying computing and communications technology is absolutely necessary to challenge that dual rhetoric of unrealistic expectations on the one hand and technogeddon on the other. If possible, we need to stop this constant swing from one pole to the other, because then we might just be able to strike that balance between reaping the benefits and minimizing the threats. And with that, thank you very much, Marta. I'll let somebody else have a turn.
Okay, so thank you for this. Sarah, do we want to go on, or should we open it to questions at this point?
Well, let's hear everyone speak, and then we'll go on to questions at the end. I think it's probably best.
Okay, thank you. So thanks for this perspective. I have to say we did have some networking problems, so it was a very interesting exercise to try to work out the words that we missed out. I did manage to most of the time. Okay, that's the challenges of working in a virtual world, successfully, hopefully, in the long run. Okay, so we will now move on to Matt Webb, who is a physicist by background, but he has been working with innovation companies, for example, Google, and he is going to talk to us about his most recent experience with technology startups. And I imagine that Zoom is an example of a technology startup that I think COVID made into a huge company. Matt, over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Marta, and hello, everyone. Yeah, I work in innovation, so that's sometimes with large technology firms like Google, but also with startups, the newest companies. And I ran a startup accelerator for a couple of years, investing in and supporting companies at that stage. So I have a kind of an interest in what the next big thing is going to be. So I like to dig in and get to things from the first principles and consider the sort of the human and sort of context systems to find opportunities there. And I suppose, that's where my head's been going. These last 10 months, I think I've been sort of glued to this chair, like many people here, kind of, we're working from home now, or, our habits have changed. And I think, the analyst Benedict Evans talked about it as being a giant public forced experiment. which I quite like as a way of thinking about it. You know, we're all using Zoom. I'm not sure I would have chosen to work like that. We're working from anywhere. I'm not sure people will want to go back. And, you know, so that's the interesting thing, right? Like we might not have chosen online grocery deliveries, right? But here we are, right? Like online grocery deliveries has doubled from 5 to 10% in the UK since the first lockdown. And, you know, I've now discovered I've got better things to do on the weekend than go to Sainsbury's. So that's a kind of a one-way transition. And I think that will be true for many of us. So all kinds of things are, you know, that, you know, we take for granted, like mundane, everyday things are up in the air now. So, you know, what our homes are for, you know, where I get my lunch, is it prepped? Well, not anymore. How we present ourselves, you know, I'm wearing slippers now on a Zoom panel, right? Like, so maybe it's better for me professionally to invest more in my bookshelves than it is in my shoes. So, all, you know, when these kind of basic behavior changes happen, they're exciting from a disruption and a startup perspective because they open up a ton of new opportunities. But especially because we're also entering, just by coincidence, the deployment phase of a new fundamental technology, which is machine learning, sometimes called AI. So machine learning, just to kind of provide another way of thinking about it, it's how come, you know, it's how come your phone can identify faces and photos. It's how come adverts on Facebook are so, you know, uncannily accurate, sometimes to the point that people believe their phones are listening to them. And in terms of like predicting its potential in whatever industry you're in, this is another Benedict Evans line. Machine learning lets a computer do whatever an intern can do. You know, so that gives you a sort of a measure of it, right? Like it's not, in terms of the smartness available, it's not artificial intelligence, it's artificial interns, you know. What would you do with 10,000 incredibly reliable interns you didn't need to retrain and didn't need to sleep? So, for example, you know, one of the areas that I've been tracking that's enabled by machine learning is RPA, robotic process automation, which is basically like all the busy work you do to operate a company, you know, like checking and paying invoices or calling up suppliers and getting quotes or triaging support queries or like filing your documents for Companies House, finalizing contracts, all those things that took teams of back office people. Maybe in the not too distant future, you'll be able to just show your computer how to do it once and it can take it from there. And maybe this kind of automation changes what companies can be. Again, from a startup perspective, really interesting. So this has been on my mind a lot because where I get my lunch has changed, right? A friend of mine has started a local soup company. So she makes soup at home. She delivers on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Menus and reorders happen on WhatsApp. You know, it's a small business. And it turns out there are tons of these. I just saw by coincidence on BBC News this morning, 44% of new food businesses started since first lockdown are based at home, to the point that local authorities are constrained on the numbers they can inspect. So I know other people with cocktail companies delivering, you know, premium cocktails in little pouches through the post. Someone else I know has started a local delivery company. It's a bit like a milk float for delivering artisan bread from local shops. And, you know, if I were a startup founder now, and these were the old days, and by old days, I mean 2019, I'd be looking at this and going, you know, Deliveroo, Uber Eats, you know, I'd link all these soup and cocktail startups together and make kind of a giant marketplace, getting all the economies of scale lined up from consolidating the marketing and operations and capture the value over the top. And these, I have to say, these massive marketplaces, as a human, as a person, they concern me because they create what Peter Reinhardt called above the API and below the API jobs. So below the API jobs are where you get dispatched like software, like an Uber driver or a warehouse shift worker, and you end up getting squeezed into a minimum wage or 0-hour contract situation because you've effectively been commoditized. And the state picks up the bill eventually because it has to provide the safety net. So, you know, in the future, this is another way of putting it. There are two kinds of jobs. You know, either you tell the machine what to do, or the machine tells you what to do. And that's been the previous generation of startups. So what RPA, robotic process automation, tells that perhaps there's another way of squaring the circle. Instead of creating startups that commoditize my friend's soup company and all the others like it, could startups create tools using RPA to make my friend's soup company and others like it highly profitable, but without having to make them any larger? So as an alternative to billionaire startup founders and below the API gig worker gig economy jobs, could we instead have a middle class of small business owners, a kind of a 21st century nation of shopkeepers, right? So you don't commoditize labor, you commoditize management. And it's not such a wild idea. There's a company in France called Co-op Cycle, and they provide software for independent cycle couriers. And they take orders, dispatch deliveries, run their business for a particular city, but only if these couriers operate as a cooperative. So there's, that's a similar kind of concept. And it makes me wonder whether companies with independent contractors like Amazon should be somehow compelled to open their fulfillment flow to organizations like this and somehow favor employee-owned businesses. It's interesting to think about the regulatory interventions to make that possible. So for me, success in a post-COVID world looks like taking these new technologies and applying them in such a way that new businesses, new startups represent our values and our resilience. There's something similar happening in the manufacturing supply chain at the moment. The old centralized supply chains are breaking up. So there's a British electric vehicle manufacturer called Arrival, which is now operating instead of a central factory with small factories near their customers. Unilever has figured out how to build nano factories and shipping containers, putting manufacturing again right by their customers, maybe inside online grocery shop warehouses, which provides more local jobs and decarbonization at the same time. And creating these kind of new network supply chains takes, again, software. So I think, just to wrap up, in the startup world, where we've been used to for years thinking about this idea called tech for good, which is the overall phrase for all this kind of stuff. And we're used to thinking about tech for good as maybe something worthy, but maybe not very profitable, right? Like it's not interesting to investors, as interesting as the sort of blitzscalers and the unicorns of those companies that put themselves above the API. But what I'm seeing these little glimpses of, and what I hope is happening, what I believe success can be, is that there's a path to being successful in an entrepreneurial sense, but precisely by following good values and enabling others to follow theirs. And I don't know whether that's a prediction or a wish. I hope it's the former. With that, I'll hand back.
Okay, thank you. I think we probably want to move to Emily because Emily connects directly. This is Emily Reynolds, our next speaker, who is working in marketing, digital marketing at Google. And I think she's probably going to pick up on some of the themes that we heard about in Matt's presentation.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Emily, and I graduated from Trinity in 2015 when I received my MBA at Said. So really excited to be going after Matt because I'm talking about some similar themes and concepts. But as my degree is not in physics, it's a slightly different perspective, and I wanted to share more of a business perspective on the opportunities that we see coming out of COVID. And not just for big tech, but really narrowing down on those small businesses like the little soup shop where Matt gets his lunch from, and how they can grow and succeed in this new world that we're living in today in COVID and in the future as our behaviors truly change long-term, well after we're all vaccinated and hopefully the pandemic is a thing of the past. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about the rise of e-commerce in the last year and the opportunities that exist today and into the future for small businesses. And I wanted to start with the saying that I thought captured the moments of March and April quite well from Scottish MP George Galloway when he said, "Nothing can happen for decades, and then decades can happen in weeks." And I think that's exactly what happened in March and April last year. When you think about your own behavior, you were likely going to shops, restaurants, movie theaters, art galleries in February, March, and then all of a sudden, you were not certain whether you could leave your home. And with this huge shift in the world around us, everything shifted, and your behavior as a consumer altered drastically. And so, as Matt mentioned, one of the big changes is around e-commerce and how we buy things, from food, retail, everything really. And what we saw was a huge increase in the e-commerce within that 6-week period. It went from, in the beginning of 2020 in the United States, 16% of retail was transacted through digital channels. By the end of April, it was at 27%, and in the UK, it's now at 30%, with, as Matt said, 10% of all grocery sales are now digital in the UK. And this market, the opportunity continues, as a third of those individuals who currently do not purchase online say that they will in the future. So this is only going to continue to grow. And so after growing only 1% for the last 20 years, in 8 weeks, it grew by 10 percentage points. So we think about how your behavior shifted, how everyone around shifted, and you went online, and what that means for all the businesses around you. And while I do work at Google, I don't want this to be the story of Google and Amazon and what their last year looked like. If you want to know about that, just take a look at the recent earnings reports, as they were undoubtedly beneficiaries. But there's far more to the story than just big tech when it comes to COVID and changing consumer behaviors. Many businesses that were not always digital first suddenly were forced to go online in a matter of days. And consumer behavior opened and broadened. Before the pandemic, 85% of all commerce research was with Amazon or Google. And now it is a fraction of that, as people are searching not just for what they need on Amazon Prime on the internet, but for very small niche brands, and are open to exploring new brands. So today, there's a much broader application of e-commerce and an openness to exploration, given we're limited in what we can actually do in stores. So that really creates this unique entry point for businesses to offer something niche, like the soups that Matt gets, and local, and deliver that to the consumer in a way that's safe. And this did not exist before the pandemic. And that is the opportunity that I want to talk about. And the work that we've done at Google around e-commerce is extensive. And from a business perspective, it's one of our key priorities and will continue to be well through this decade. But there's some insights around how do you actually reach these consumers who are now at home through the pandemic? How do you engage them with your brand and be successful as a business while meeting the needs of the customer? And there's three key insights that I wanted to share. And one of them is actually exactly what Matt was talking about. So the first one is stand for something. And this is the importance that individuals place on a brand standing for a cause, having a mission, and leading a purpose. And that is something that has become increasingly important through the rise of the pandemic. And I think is also a great development for, the future outlook of the world today in the pandemic and into the future. And when they look at the different demographics of the population, this interest and focus when looking to buy a product is particularly pronounced within the younger demographics, so millennials and Gen Zs. The second key insight is radically step change your digital presence. And what this is about is, for a brand, you need to be simple. Consumers don't want loads and loads of different offers. They want something targeted, specific, and to help them make a decision quickly. This paradox of choice is at play here. And using data and understanding and having a strong point of view on who you're reaching will enable you to be more successful as a brand. And the final recommendation is deliver distinct experiences and use data to your benefit. And this is where first-party data is so critical. And I think that this is a piece that every business, as we look forward today and into the future, needs to work with and engage with. and to ensure that they're reaching the customers and consumers the way that they want to be reached with the products that they want. So in summary, while the last 12 months have undoubtedly been incredibly challenging for everyone, I see with the rise of e-commerce a real opportunity, not just for big tech, but for small shop owners, business people around the world to go online, and by using these three key principles around purpose, distinct simplicity, and distinct experiences, be successful and create a whole new economy that is broad and diverse in ways that it never was before the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. I think this is probably a good point to check whether there are any questions to the first three speakers, because the last speaker is going to talk about something slightly different. So I just wanted to open this to anyone who might want to ask a question. I think I would like to ask, do we have a question?
Well, I was going to ask Trudy what she did for the police department. Did you track down any criminals, or were you setting up their computer systems?
Do you mean Trudy, or do you mean Victoria?
I think it was Victoria. I'm sorry.
Victoria.
I'm sorry.
Trudy is somewhere here.
That's all right, not to worry. And yes, I mean, obviously I can't tell you in too much detail. Yeah, I did various things. I worked as an intelligence analyst in various different organizations. So local police, national police, and then I was head of threat analysis at Europol, the European Police Office. But then I moved from there to work for Facebook in government relations. So the same clientele, the same customer base, but the job flipped on its head.
Thank you.
So I would like to ask Victoria, what role does she see for technologists? Trinity now takes computer science students. Is there any specific advice that you might give them if they want to work, in your area, which is very broad? It goes from regulation all the way, but it does rely on technology in many ways.
Do you know, it's a fabulous question, because we think a lot about how we can translate very techie issues into accessible language for policymakers and for so-called ordinary. It's a very polarized debate even about that. We talk a lot about, having to give engineers lessons in how to talk to the board in a company, or, how to talk to government ministers. And, certainly my experience to some extent in big tech has been that we only let certain engineers out to talk to ministers because we don't want to give them the wrong impression, or we don't want to blind them with science. I think we overstate that problem sometimes, but certainly what we need to see is a marriage between the very technical, the code, and the policy issues, because I think a lot of the problems we're seeing is that gap in the translation. We're seeing heavy-handed regulation because the policymakers don't understand the technology. It's not always the case that engineers are the best people to convey that information. So how we upskill engineers and computer science students for the future of that communication, I think is the real secret.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, excuse me. I have a quick question here, if you don't mind. My background is in artificial intelligence and machine learning. I did a DPhil at Trinity between '96 and 2000, and I've since moved on to slightly different field. But this is a question, I suppose, from Matt and indeed Emily as well. So you spoke, and I thought very eloquently, about the rapid changes we have seen recently due to the COVID pandemic. And I wonder if an underlying assumption in a lot of the stuff that you have discussed is that we'll remain in this state going forward, regardless of what happens as we begin to unwind from this pandemic, right? So, for example, you spoke about people working a lot from home, people developing soup deliveries and soup kitchens. I can speak from experience that a lot of my colleagues who I speak to regularly can't wait to get back into the office. I think, the first few months, it was a novel experience. I think a year in, people now want to return. And I'm wondering what's going to happen once some people begin to return and others, decide to remain at home, as I'm sure the opportunity will be available to do so. But then begin to realize that actually the people who are in the office are in close proximity to the boss and the decision makers. I wonder how that's going to influence people's behavior going forward. So it's really a question on the assumptions you've made about how this economy is going to move forward as we begin to revert, as we begin to bounce back from the pandemic, on the assumption that we will revert in some way, shape, or form. Not a fair question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Like, will we revert or not? Talking to some folks recently who work in commercial real estate, what they're seeing is there's a consensus towards moving to kind of giving people the option of 3 days in the office, 2 days at home. And that's changing the way that leases are being made on buildings. I think what's interesting is a lot of the big tech companies are moving to treat remote employees on a peer level with people who are in the office. You do things like that by having meetings always happening over video. But one of the drivers for that is that people who don't work in the metropolitan areas are cheaper. So there's kind of like an economic reason for it, as well as the fact that people just want to be able to work from everywhere. So I kind of think that there's going to be some things where people don't want to go back. There's going to be some things where people see opportunities to do things in new ways. So people want to be able to travel around. It means that maybe technology won't be in such a kind of a bubble of metropolitan elite, right? Because people will be more scattered around and embedded in communities. And also that it will be the tools will be better because the big tech firms are working on these. So I think these are glimpses. I think for resilience, would be foolish to go back to the way it was before. It's possible we'll get a pandemic like this every 5 years, maybe. So we need to have some kind of resilience built in. And yeah, so that's kind of how I see it. It's not a certainty, but we need the capabilities to be able to operate remotely and in new ways.
Okay, thank you. And of course, by remotely, you mean globally as well, right? Time zone.
Yep.
Okay.
And I would just echo Matt that we would likely expect some kind of hybrid working model. And I don't think that there's certain interactions that happen in person that are very important. And there is no desire to go totally virtual for everything. But that said, there's the expectation in the future will be around flexibility for employees, and it will never be 5 days a week in the office again. So I agree, a hybrid model. And I think the thing that really will go away is all the business travel. A huge amount of that, I think, will now go by the wayside as we have this understanding that so much of that can be done virtually.
Okay, we'll see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we should now go to Sinead Doyle, who is a strategy director at PA Consulting. And she has been working on COVID. So obviously this was her opportunity. And she is going to tell us about how digital inclusion impacts vaccine uptake.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And it's been really fascinating to hear the other speakers. I'm sure we've got lots to talk about afterwards. So please do feel free to ask questions, more questions of them after I've finished. as I've said, I'm a digital strategist by trade. And what does that mean? Well, traditionally, it's meant that I've helped people when they need to build a new website or an app or do something to do with computers. But broadly, as everything becomes digital, my role has become a bit broader, and I've become much more involved in service design. And a service broadly is the end-to-end delivery of, well, almost anything. And a service or a product as big as the COVID vaccination program is quite a daunting challenge. I'd say from when I joined the program in September, it's been a whirlwind 5 months of probably the most complex and fast-paced project I've ever worked on. And I think it's probably fair to say, in terms of purpose, I've worked with large banking companies. I've done things with big budgets and things for large brands before in marketing and also in digital services. But this is probably the first project I've ever worked on where there's such an obvious important purpose. Like, it feels like it's the only important thing that I've ever been involved in. So it is obviously an enormous challenge, and I'm just one person in a huge team. So I'll tell you a little bit about kind of how we're operating and what we've been doing in terms of enabling the COVID vaccination program. But broadly, we are working with NHS England and with NHS Improvement and NHS Digital to ensure that the vaccination program has the technology and the tooling that it needs, both at the front end of the interfaces that the public can use, but also the back-end technology that supports all of the wonderful staff members and the doctors and nurses and the support staff and volunteers who are helping to enable vaccination to happen in all of the different sites across the country. So it's quite a big and sprawling task. The specific team that I'm working with is in the technology and data work stream. But of course, there are also people involved in the workforce team who are involved in recruiting some of those people to actually be vaccinators, training people who have been hired in order to deliver this service. There's also a huge number of people dealing in logistics, literally kind of the equipment, the personal protective equipment, which to me will always be PPE. As a PPEist, I'll never be able to unlearn that acronym as anything else. But there's a huge team involved in understanding how the lorries will go from warehouses and keep the cold chain and arrive delivering the supplies to all of the different locations. So it is a big and complex team. But when we joined initially from a sort of digital strategy perspective, the first thing that we needed to do was understand how the service was intended to operate. And I don't know how much anyone has read up about what's going on in vaccines, but the main ways in which you can get a vaccination are either from a hospital hub, so that's in an NHS hospital trust, by going to a big, large-scale vaccination centre, by going to a local vaccination site, such as that might be run by your GP or by a local primary care network or a local pharmacy. Or you might have a roving visit if you are housebound or if you're in a care home. So that's 4 very different delivery models, very different ways of getting the vaccine, from ultimately a warehouse into a vial to the right place, to the right people, and into your arm. So we began by actually drawing up service maps for the end-to-end journey of what an individual would go through from the point that they are identified as an eligible person from one of the cohorts that are prioritized. So for example, the over 80s, for example, those who are clinically extremely vulnerable, to the point where they are invited for a vaccination, either via the national program or by their local GP, to the point where they actually attend that appointment and they have the jab, and we record not just which kind of vaccine they had, but whether it was the first dose or the second dose, what batch number it was for safety reasons, whether they had it in the left arm or the right arm, all of those important details, and making sure that they come back for their second dose, as there are 2 doses of the available vaccines at the moment, and making sure that that vaccination event actually gets fed back into an individual's patient record with their registered GP. So to actually deliver that, there's a huge amount of different technology systems, and GPs in their practices tend to use different patient record systems, and all of those need to work together so that we have a nationwide database of exactly who has been vaccinated, whether they are eligible, whether they've had their first, whether they've had their second. And as this becomes potentially a rolling, ongoing annual vaccination campaign, how we iterate from a very quick and dirty prototype, which is what's kind of going on since Christmas, to a mature annual business as usual campaign, much like the flu vaccination program. So all of this against a backdrop of shifting vaccine delivery dates, policy U-turns, arbitrary government deadlines. It's been very difficult just to keep on top of what's true and where we are and what the numbers are and what the milestones and deadlines are. So I think it's really important to reflect on the fact that as a country, although the number of cases we've had and perhaps some of the decisions and swiftness of those decisions could be criticized, in terms of the speed of the rollout of the vaccination program, we're doing very well compared with other nations, and that's great. And there's been a huge team who's been responsible for making sure that across the country we've vaccinated something in the region of 15 million people already, and we've met some very ambitious targets for numbers of jabs. But I think, to come back to our topic today about success, for our team, specifically for the service design team, success is not just a graph going up and to the right. Because actually, if you look at the number of jabs given, the number of doses, if we had the highest total number of vaccinations given in the world, but only the elite or only the most privileged or only those who are registered with a GP or only those who have engaged with the health service before had been vaccinated, we will have failed. So I think it's very important for us to think about our wider mission of ensuring actually that there is equality of access to vaccines. And we've tried to do as much user research as we can throughout the program, talking to individuals about their attitudes towards vaccination. And we've certainly seen there's a huge amount of misinformation and conspiracy theories out there. Digital literacy is a big part of that. There is a correlation between those who are less able online and less digitally literate and less social media savvy and their likelihood to take up the vaccine. So that's a big issue that needs addressing at a much higher level than us, at a kind of communications level and at a policy level. In terms of the staff that we talk to, there's a huge range of ages. So when we look at volunteers and people who are actually in vaccination centres distributing the vaccine, there are people who are rejoining the workforce who maybe have not used a tablet before, or who are not very familiar with the software systems that they're being asked to use in order to record the vaccine. And we've certainly encountered issues where the usability of the systems is a problem for the diversity of different kinds of staff who are using them. And very often in software design, the systems that are used internally or for staff are much less carefully and rigorously tested for usability. And when you come to use a software tool on a program of this scale, that really comes back to bite you, because you realize that actually a returning doctor who's confused by a date picker in a field, suddenly that means that they're taking 6 minutes to vaccinate someone rather than 3 minutes. And actually that at a big enough scale can significantly reduce the number of people you're able to help. So digital literacy in that sense has been a big issue for us, and we've had to look at the training that we provide people with to help them do their jobs better, and also to make sure that we reach the right people. Broader than that, there's also, of course, the societal inequality issue. And the NHS does have a person who's been appointed as a kind of equalities leader. When we've been talking to our kind of colleagues who've worked on Test and Trace and other programs like that, we've noticed that there are some very big challenges with reaching the entire population, because you have groups that are harder to reach, and these are often called health inclusion groups. It's a bit unfair to call them hard to reach, because really it just means that we haven't tried hard enough to reach them. But when you think of the breadth of these groups, it could be people who are homeless. It could be people who are asylum seekers, migrants, or have recently moved to this country. It could be people who are just not registered with a GP because they're mostly quite healthy and they've never had to engage with the health service. So there's a huge number of people that we might otherwise miss because they're not in our database, or they don't have an address, or they don't have a device, or they don't have an email. So it's not good enough for us to look at the problem of getting people vaccines just as build a booking website and let them, access through a device and book an appointment online and they'll be fine. Actually, we have to think about not just a booking website for appointments, but also the ability to phone a call center and have an assisted booking journey. And for those who even that won't be possible for them, we have to think about how we facilitate that roving vaccination model, so that those who are in very isolated locations, those who can't leave their homes, those who are in very rural locations, or those who otherwise are unable to travel to a large vaccination center or even their GP practice, how do they get access to the vaccine? So really, it's not just a technology problem. There are wider access problems than that. But in terms of what we can do in what's in our remit, what's in the scope of what we can do, how can we do our best to ensure equality of access to vaccines? I think the first thing that we can do, that is a small but important step, is to make sure that we're doing user research as early and as often as possible. So actually speaking to people who want to book the vaccine and understanding what might be stopping them, understanding what their issues are. I've sat in on some sessions where we've recruited extremely vulnerable users and spoken to them about their needs and what they might need in order to feel comfortable or safe in going to a vaccination center. In some cases, that's as simple as allowing them to express a preference for filtering a vaccination center that has wheelchair access. Or in other cases, it might be that they want to take someone with them to support them as they go and get their vaccine. In other cases, we've seen that there are questions in the booking process that could put people off. So someone who wants to book a vaccination might reach a question in that journey and think twice, or think, oh, maybe this service is not for me. So for example, my colleague Emma was doing some very important work in trying to remove a question about sex or gender from the booking process, because there isn't really any reason why we need to know someone's sex or gender in order to vaccinate them. However, for technology reasons, if the underlying database needs that field to be filled in order to run a call against that database to match someone to the right record, that's a technology reason for asking a question that might be quite intrusive or might put some people off. So those questions are very important to get feedback from those who are affected, so that we understand how we can either remove the need to ask that question or ask it in a sensitive way so that it doesn't put them off. I think it's also very important for us to make sure that we're not, as a centralized team, dictating how those on the ground actually run their services. So we know that to reach those who are, for example, homeless or asylum seekers, we will have to work very closely with grassroots groups, councils, charities, in order to reach them. And we can't do that as a centralized team with NHS England. We have to enable people who are already doing this kind of outreach and make sure that the systems that we're giving them allow them to do their jobs without throwing up any barriers that they can't meet. So for example, if homeless people are less likely to have an NHS number, we need to make sure that there is a way for their vaccination to be recorded without having to create or have an NHS number for them, or a way to very quickly create an NHS number for them. So some of those issues, if we address them, and ideally we do, we'll be able to see whether we've succeeded only by measuring vaccine uptake across the entire population, not just as totals and as big headline figures, but actually across regions, across rural and urban, across ethnicities, across demographics, and across those very diverse health inclusion groups. So having identified where there are people who are less likely to take a vaccine or who we're not currently reaching, we then need targeted communications and campaigns, influencer engagement and outreach work to reach them so that those groups are not left behind. So I think it's very important that we fairly distribute the vaccine to give disadvantaged groups the best chance of surviving this pandemic. And I think for us, success is an equal uptake of the vaccine across societal groups, which will lead to lower case rates, lower death rates, and less unequal, unfair concentration of harm in the most vulnerable groups in our society. And I think if we look even wider than the UK, this also applies across nations. There's been a lot of talk about vaccine nationalism and how the rich countries can't just hoard all the supplies of vaccine, because ultimately, if there are nations that are left behind, those countries will be reinfected by their neighbors. So really, we can only beat this virus together on a national and a supranational level. And I think success really in a post-COVID world is recognizing the equal value of every human life in every nation. So that's a big old challenge. I hope we get there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Sinead. That's a fascinating insight into our vaccination program. So, okay, I think we've got some questions now on the chat. Sarah, do you want to come in to help?
Oh yeah, well, so I've got one. Can you see any? I've got one that I had for Matt about the cycle cooperative in France.
Okay.
You mentioned. Because I watched last year. One of the things I did was watch the "Sorry We Missed You" film about the gig economy, about the delivery drivers. So I'm really interested to hear places that are trying to do delivery better.
Yeah, the gig economy has a particularly bad reputation for squeezing workers, which is why this organization is called Co-op Cycle. And what they do is they've made software to basically to run your own contract delivery company, right? So it lets people, there are fairly standard parts of that now. You have to take orders, you have to go and pick up parcels, you have to, run dispatch, you have to pay people, and so on. And what I like about this organization is the software is free for co-ops to use. So if you're a group of cyclists, you can kind of say, you can get together and you can say, we want to take Oxford, we want to take Birmingham. You can create your co-op there and you'll get the software for free. And I think the reason I find that quite exciting is you can see quite a few alternative business models now starting up, which are hard to do. So, the Brewdog pubs kind of got their community to, build their business with equity for punks. There's an energy company called Ripple, which is allowing communities to fund their own local wind farms, which I find really interesting. You know, the big institutions might not be interested in renewable energy because it's not as profitable, but the community might be interested in renewable, and you get the yield from the wind turbines back as credits against your energy bill. So yeah, I'm interested in how do we use modern software and startup techniques to let people engage in things like mutualism that haven't been so easy before.
Thanks.
Okay, so Matt, so I think before we move to the next question from Sarah, but please, everybody, if you have questions, can you think of some questions? You can put them on the chat. Yeah, so Matt, you were talking about, you know, the soup kitchens, but these kinds of businesses are low margin businesses. So how can you create the middle class that you've mentioned? How can you increase the margins, or are we really looking at a shift towards values? You know.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Like, I think one of the things that happens is local businesses get squeezed by large businesses because the large businesses have access to national marketing and to those kind of economies of scale. But are there ways of providing the same benefits to small ones? So, you know, if you look in the e-commerce space, you can see on the one hand, there's Amazon, which encourages small, almost invisible merchants, and they kind of get squashed underneath that large shop, versus Shopify, which is a technology platform that enables people to start small businesses and continue to own those businesses and to differentiate based on brand and values. So can we make businesses which operate in the real world a bit more like the Shopifys than the Amazons? The soup company is low margin, but it maybe works very, very well if you've only got 100 customers and you just want to do a few streets. So I think there's a question about what kind of scale we want to operate at. You know, let's kind of maybe operate in a way where it's more about neighborhood and community and going to see people's faces. And those kind of businesses can work for all kinds of reasons, not just kind of high profit margins. If only we build the support structures.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, do you want to ask your question to Emily?
Oh yeah, it's just someone asked if Emily could restate her third point. I don't know if it works on its own or whether you need to quickly do the other two as well, just to remind us what you said.
Oh, yeah, happy to, if I can remember. So my 3 points around the kind of 3 key pillars of being successful from e-commerce perspective in for not just a large online business, but for smaller startups as well, any kind of direct consumer business. Our first one was have a purpose. And that was tying into what Matt was talking about how like actually during COVID, there's been increased emphasis on the importance of values, brand values, standing for something, what that means. So that's point 1. Point 2 was around simplicity, and actually this paradox of choice is a real thing, and people don't want to have a million different offerings, especially if you're a smaller online business. You want to just effectively show the person what they're looking for and keep it simple. And the final recommendation was around delivering a distinct experience to your customer, and doing this in part through the role of data. And the idea being that today customers really don't want to define themselves through their age, gender, or demographic, but really defining themselves on their interests and principles. It's building your brand and really think about who you want to reach, and the data, and like thinking about the ways that you can reach them makes you really stand out on an online platform, as well as I think just in general. So just shifting values means you have to think about how your brand will also shift simultaneously to be successful at this time, whether you're really small or really big, but I think even more important if you're small.
Okay.
Thanks, Emily, that's great.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have a question from Dominic. Dominic, can you? It's a question to Sinead and Matt?
Yeah, sure. So I'm just interested in whether there's a connection between Sinead's, your really interesting point about the centralized service not dictating how vaccination works at a local level, and Matt, your prediction or wish that the software supports the distribution of economic benefits. So is there a connection between those two things? Are they two sides of the same coin?
That was my question too. So I want to know this one.
I hope they are. I think the interesting thing about the structure of the NHS, and I'm by no means an expert in how it works, or it's almost an imaginary thing. It's so big and there's so many different departments. It is a thing that has a centralized body, but also has so much power decentralized to its regions, that it's quite complex to understand how you can do anything at a national level. And if you do try and force people to use any process, ultimately you'll find they'll do what works and ignore you if what you're suggesting doesn't work for them. So I think in a software sense, we're having to design for the fact that, for example, GPs in their practices use lots of different tools, and we're trying to make sure that it's possible for them to follow a process which can be enabled by those tools. So that means working with some of the big GP providers like TPP and EMIS and Vision, and some of the newer alternatives such as Accurix, for those software companies to provide the ability to capture COVID vaccination information. And in a way, the kind of procurement frameworks that allow people to do that allow these companies to respond to the requirements that have been set out, I believe should be flexible enough that a new small local software tool could spring up and say, we can do this, we can meet your needs, we can provide this service cheaper, better locally. I'd love to see local software co-ops springing up. I see no reason why you shouldn't have technology being built locally for local users. And I'd love to see a more decentralized world in sort of technology provision. I think co-ops are fascinating, and in terms of decentralized kind of models of healthcare, is it Burzorg who have a model of local nursing teams, and they have a software tool which enables those local nurses to self-manage. And I think it now must be a fascinating time to be looking at cooperatives and their resilience, because only when you have a big economic shock can you look at whether cooperatives, by spreading the wealth a bit more fairly perhaps, can actually weather the storm that can knock out some of their competitors. So it would be really interesting to see if as a workaround, some of the local mutual aid systems that have sprung up stick around in the long term after COVID, because they're found to work and because there is easier access to small and adaptable software today.
If I can just jump in on that point, that's one of the reasons I was paying sort of close attention, Sinead, to what you were saying, because I think as large as the pandemic response is, it's training wheels for decarbonisation, and the transformation that's going to be happening there is going to be much vaster, but I think is going to tap the same kind of skills and abilities that you're figuring out right now. So if we're able to respond in a way which involves everyone and doesn't just kind of mean that we have very, very large companies taking control of it all, which I think would lead to other kind of problems. We want to do decarbonisation, but we want to do it in the right way. So yeah, interesting to see what kind of lessons we can take.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think we have the next person, we have Clint. I guess this is probably for Victoria. Do you want to ask the question? Oh, you are muted.
As you know, Russia, for instance, has hacked into American computer networks involving elections, and companies are often vulnerable to being hacked, their software and their computer systems. And it seems to me every company, every government is going to have super anti-hacking specialists, because this is a big problem commercially and for governments. Just wanted to ask about people being trained to do that.
Yeah, so there's a huge cybersecurity skills gap. But I think the good news is that we now have specialist degrees in cybersecurity in universities all over the world. So I think, you know, we're steadily filling that gap. But as you rightly say, you know, this is an issue that affects individuals. It's an issue that affects corporates, and it's an issue that affects governments as well. So, you know, if you're into cybersecurity, you know, this is a career that is very much in demand if you train in that area. I think what you've touched on, though, is a really, really interesting issue, because when we're looking at governments defending themselves against cyber attacks, then we're really talking about what governments call active defense, which is, of course, hacking in itself. More about the kind of the cyber command in the US or the cyber force in the UK doing offensive operations to preempt the attacks that they will experience. Then we've got corporate espionage. And I think it's fair to say we probably know that corporates are doing that to each other as well. Yes. Yeah. And then we have the cybercrime, the volume crime that we all experience as individuals. Then we have the kind of the bleeding from one layer to the other in something like influence operations, where we have election interference that's using social media, or anti-vax interference that's trying to influence individuals who are suddenly now on the front line of cyber operations and cyber defense in a way that they haven't been, I would say, that they weren't 10 years ago. And I think that's another reason why I think it's so important for individuals now, members of the community, speaking to Trudy's next question for Sinead, you know, people who haven't necessarily been digital natives, to really engage in skilling themselves up, protecting themselves, improving their digital literacy, and then they can protect other members in society as well. You know, there are great examples of, you know, Age Concern in the UK and the Women's Institute training what I would, you know, disparagingly refer to as nanas, you know, training grandmas to protect their families and their communities. And I want to see a lot more of that, because otherwise we risk leaving certain members of society behind online.
Thank you.
Thank you. Trudy, you were already introduced. Can you ask your question to Sinead?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the background is really that some of my volunteering that I do, which is on hold at the moment, but contains other individuals who are perhaps in their early 80s, and they missed out in their working life on the internet, really. And some of them have never really quite got a handle on how to do things. So Zoom is proving tricky, etc. But it strikes me you get cut out of such a lot. Then I look at myself and I think, well, you know, I'm not in my 80s yet, but, you know, it will come. Am I able to keep up? Will there come a time when I'm detached from it? I hope to keep in there. So it seems to me that if there was something that was not just the computer in the local library, but was a bit more accessible, it could have a potential for informing you about local things and about opportunities.
I think that's so important, that it's not just about the ease of using a piece of technology. It's actually about the human who's willing to sit there patiently and support you through that learning process. I would definitely be on the sort of the opinion that everyone can learn, but it does take the right motivation. So, for example, my parents, my father's just turned 90 and my mother's just turning 80. And the reason that they started to use things like Hangouts and Zoom and Facebook even was to see their grandchildren. And with the carrot of seeing your grandchildren, they'll learn anything, and they, you know, once you've got them using it, they love it, and you can't keep them off it. But I think if you're isolated, it's so much harder to make a start, and to without someone who's going to handhold you through the process, I think it is harder. I think a lot of the valuable work that some of the outreach and local charities teams do is actually in taking those first steps with people. And in some cases, it could be facilitated by, there's a drop-in session in the local library, or it could be people kind of, you know, going door to door, or kind of assisting with things such as ordering groceries. At the beginning of the first lockdown, there was a huge scramble for grocery delivery slots. And if you had never shopped online before and you didn't know how to do it, there was this high risk that you might be afraid you were going to starve. You know, you probably didn't, but at the same time, as a concerned child, you know, for my parents, the last time I saw them before that lockdown, I made sure that they had an online account with the nearest Morrison's and that they knew how to use it. But again, if something goes wrong or if they get stuck, how to give remote support, how to actually kind of talk someone through, whether that's by kind of taking over someone's screen, those kind of screen sharing capabilities that allow you to remotely drive someone else's machine. I think a lot of organizations are getting a lot better at that. And I think local charities and local organizations are starting to think about how they need to have a team with skills for digital literacy, because we can't just rely on people's well-meaning relatives when we have to do things at scale.
Thank you. Very good.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions, probably, I guess, the last two. The first one is from Sue.
I was looking at the speakers and thinking that, in a way, the people who are speaking resemble those who speak in law. So you either come into your career from a background in that subject, like a law degree in law, or you've come to it bringing other skills from other degrees. And I wondered if you think, as things get more complicated, or to me they seem more complicated, echoing what Trudy's saying, is there always going to be a place, do you think, for people coming into IT from those other degrees, like classics or PPE or whatever? And that's to everybody, really.
Anyone feel free to jump in? Matt?
Well, I will jump in very quickly and go, I hope so, right? It's like that line about you don't want politicians who are professional politicians, right? I kind of don't want people who are, you know, only experienced computer scientists to be choosing how we use our computers. You know, the virtual world is not, you know, is part of our lives now. And you want it to be built by people who understand that sometimes we, you know, help other people with their grocery orders. I think it's like it's a big design problem that our grocery shops were not organized so I could do the shopping on behalf of my mum, right? That's kind of ridiculous. And that sort of displays, you know, how people used it in the first place. So I hope that many multidisciplinary, lots of different backgrounds things stays, even though people are studying computer science now.
And then for me, I think it's necessary from a diversity and inclusion perspective. So, you know, if we look specifically at the branch of cybersecurity, that has largely drawn people from the military who've worked in signals. So, you know, we absolutely need to, in order to have a more diverse workforce, yes, we can encourage more women and more people from different ethnicities to apply for a computer science degree. But until then, we need to draw women and people from different backgrounds from those different disciplines. So we've got a problem that we need to fix in my particular branch of IT.
Thank you.
I think I would echo that in terms of the value of learning through working in different sectors, giving you a different problem-solving approach. I guess as a PPEist, I would say that it's good to study multiple things because clearly I could never make up my mind. But I think the question of how you navigate through your career it's increasingly difficult to feel like you can honestly tell a young person graduating that there's any one stable career path in anything, regardless of whether you've studied something that's traditionally considered to be more vocational. So I think the degree courses that teach flexibility and that value and appetite for learning, and that prepare you with thinking skills to attack problems from different angles, actually set you up very well for a very changeable and fluid workplace, where my job title this year is not the same as it was 5 years ago and won't be the same in 5 years' time. So in that sense, I think if you start in computer science, it doesn't mean that you'll stay in computer science. But equally, if you don't start in computer science, there are plenty of other ways to get there.
Okay, thank you. I should just add, because Victoria, for example, was talking about upskilling computer scientists towards the regulation. So in my department, we now have a course which is, so it's actually one module. It's law and computer science, and it is taught to two halves. So it's both computer scientists and law students that attend it. They have to do projects together. And the idea is to get the lawyers to understand what the technology can do, and the technologies to learn from the lawyers how to communicate, and also the various regulatory issues. So I think it's a very good point, Sue. Thanks for your perspective. It's it's I think a very important thing to consider. Okay, so I think we are now coming up to 7, but we have one more question from Dominic that I think I would like to finish with. Dominic, do you want to ask?
Yeah, thank you. So I hesitate a bit to ask this question because it is kind of off the subject matter of what the speakers have presented, which has been fascinating, and that's good enough. But just a question about trust. So for me, it's a year since I've seen my boss face to face. It's a year since I've seen most of my staff. In that year, we've made some very difficult decisions, and I'm just really interested in: is there any research on the impact of trust in the workplace when you just can't see anyone face to face? I haven't made any of my team a cup of tea for a year. What's the impact of on trust in the workplace in that kind of working situation?
I can jump in from this kind of trust of security and safety perspective. So, we're still at a very, very early stage when it comes to the research on the pandemic period itself. But one of the things we do know is that, cyber criminals will exploit those vectors where there is perhaps reduced human involvement and perhaps reduced water cooler moments, as we're now referring to it. So a good example would be the increase in business email compromise in the last year or two, where the vector is that you're effectively being asked to approve payment of an invoice. And it's a sophisticated variant of a phishing email, but it looks like a business process that you normally engage in. I think one of the things that we expect is that because people don't have that moment to check with the guy sitting next to them or the woman sitting next to them, hey, I just got this email from the CTO, should I be paying this invoice? With that, because we're remote, we're not necessarily checking in as regularly on those items. And I think there is concern that there's greater scope for some of those types of compromise to be more successful. What we're lacking at the moment, of course, is hard data. And one of the challenges, because I'm looking at it from the online safety for children perspective, is when do we close this period for research? When do we decide the pandemic is over? Because it's only really in hindsight that we can see, the extent of the problems. We've considered looking at, the first lockdown in the UK, the first 3 months, and then look at what happened afterwards. But it's quite a short period of time. So that's one of the challenges for researchers is when to put that cutoff point to then decide to start doing research. Hopefully sometime next year we'll have a better idea with some of these things.
I think the question about the research and trust in the workplace is a really interesting one. And I don't have any answers, but I did want to talk briefly about the softer aspects of being in the workplace together and the need to find replacements for that. So one of the things, I'm an independent consultant, which means I spend most of my time having coffee with people. And of course, that's now not possible in the pandemic. So what I've been doing instead is in the middle of the second lockdown, I opened my calendar on Wednesdays to anybody who wants to book a call. I've had about 50 different calls now. Everything from like random people in the same industry as me in the same city, but also people who are in a tiny village in South India and talking about their life story, to people who are, on the coast in rural Canada who don't turn their cameras on because they have a degenerative condition. They want to talk about interaction design for new kinds of monitors that don't hurt their eyes. Every conversation is different. And what I've discovered is that when this is over, I won't go back. I am having more diverse conversations with more different people from more geographies than I was when I was doing it by meeting up with people who were known by people who already knew in London. And so I think, if you're experiencing in your workplace that there is a problem with not being able to sit down with people for a cup of tea, well, we're going to have to invent new ways of having cups of tea with people. And I think that would be maybe something to think about as well, because it's when it starts working, Wednesdays are now the highlight of my week.
I think that's an amazing idea, and I think we should all do the same and open our calendars. I think we'd have some fantastic conversations. I think that there's a difference between remote and distributed. And I think one of the problems that a lot of companies have had with suddenly going all remote with no experience of it is not having some of those rhythms and routines and trust building methods that companies that have been distributed by design deliberately for longer have evolved. So it's not research, but I think the Year Without Pants is a great book all about how WordPress.com has been working distributed with contributors from across the globe for a long time, and that book is probably nearly 10 years old already. So there are pockets of the software building world that have been distributed successfully for a while, and maybe we should be thinking about how they've achieved that and what parts of that we can bring to more traditional service sector businesses that maybe haven't had such an experience with supporting colleagues to form those softer connections and try and replicate those water cooler moments.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks, everybody. I mean, this was, I think, very insightful and really a fascinating look into, I think, what's happening in your working life. And I didn't even have a chance to tell you about my working life, but perhaps next time. So I would like to close now because it's 7 o'clock now. But first of all, I would like to say thank you to our speakers, Victoria, Matt, Sinead, and Emily. Thanks a lot. Also, thank you for attending and asking the questions, and especially Sarah and Sue for organizing this meeting.